Dr. Malcolm pressed the bitter liquid to his tongue and immediately recognized the metallic taste that had been killing the men of Copper Ridge for months. The amber brew that Martha Caldwell served with such maternal pride contained enough arsenic to make a man beg for death within a week. He set down the tin cup in the dusty laboratory he'd fashioned from the old grain storage room behind the general store. The afternoon sun filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across his makeshift testing apparatus. For 3 months, he'd watched strong miners and ranchers waste away into hollow-eyed ghosts, their wives weeping crocodile tears while brewing fresh batches of the very poison that was destroying them. The irony burned worse than the arsenic on his tongue. Every man in town praised their women for the exceptional beer that had become Copper Ridge's pride. Even he had complimented Mrs. Caldwell on her brewing skills when he'd first arrived, noting how the men seemed to crave it with an almost desperate hunger. Now he understood why. Malcolm wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, tasting copper and betrayal. He'd come to this godforsaken mining town 3 months ago, fresh from his medical training in Denver, expecting to treat gunshot wounds and broken bones. Instead, he'd found himself puzzling over a mysterious wasting disease that seemed to affect only the adult men, leaving the women and children untouched. The symptoms had been consistent across every case: fatigue, muscle weakness, stomach pain, and a strange metallic taste that the men complained about constantly. They'd attributed it to the mine dust, the harsh desert air, even a curse from the displaced Apache. None of them suspected the loving hands that served them their evening beer. His first clue had come from old Pete Morrison, the town drunk who'd been too far gone on rot-gut whiskey to touch the local brew. While every other man in town grew weaker by the day, Pete remained his usual obnoxious self. Malcolm had initially dismissed it as coincidence until he noticed that Pete's wife, Eleanor, had stopped trying to convince her husband to drink the good beer and had started leaving bottles of store-bought whiskey where he could find them. The second clue came from Tommy Ashworth, barely 18 and new to town, who'd taken violently ill after his first week working at the mine. His symptoms had appeared too quickly for long-term arsenic poisoning, suggesting a concentrated dose. When Malcolm questioned the boy, Tommy had mentioned that Mrs. Ashworth, his new bride, had been especially attentive, bringing him beer with every meal to keep his strength up. Malcolm had begun collecting samples then, telling the women he wanted to study the brewing process to understand what made their beer so special. They'd been delighted to share, each woman proudly explaining her particular techniques and secret ingredients. Now he realized those secret ingredients were carefully measured doses of death. The laboratory door creaked open and Martha Caldwell stepped inside, carrying a fresh bottle of her latest batch. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her flour-dusted apron gave her the appearance of everyone's beloved grandmother. The smile she wore had fooled him for months. "Doctor, Malcolm, you've been working so hard," she said, setting the bottle on his workbench with practiced casualness. "I thought you might like to try my newest recipe. I've been adjusting the hops mixture." He forced himself to smile, though his stomach churned at the sight of the innocent-looking bottle. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Caldwell. I was just finishing up my analysis of your previous batch." Her eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly, focusing on the testing equipment scattered across his bench. "Oh? And what did you discover about our little brewing secrets?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Malcolm realized with crystalline clarity that Martha Caldwell was not the simple frontier housewife she pretended to be. The intelligence behind her pale blue eyes was sharp as a surgeon's blade, and twice as dangerous. "Nothing conclusive yet," he lied smoothly, his hand casually covering the arsenic detection results. Chemistry is complex work. Sometimes what appears to be one thing turns out to be quite another. Martha's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. How true. We simple women just follow the recipes our mothers taught us. We wouldn't want to accidentally create something harmful. The emphasis on accidentally sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. She knew that he knew. The game had begun, and he was already 3 moves behind. "I'm sure your mothers were wise women," Malcolm replied carefully. "Traditional knowledge often proves more valuable than modern innovation." "Indeed." Martha picked up one of his glass testing tubes, examining it with the curiosity of a child or a predator studying new prey. "Though I sometimes wonder what would happen if someone misunderstood our traditional methods. Misinterpretation can be so dangerous." Malcolm felt sweat gather at the base of his neck despite the cool afternoon air. Every word was a carefully placed threat, delivered with the gentle concern of a woman worried about his well-being. He was beginning to understand just how brilliantly orchestrated this entire operation had been. As Martha turned to leave, she paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. "Dr. Malcolm, you haven't been drinking enough of our local beer lately. The men have been commenting on it. They worry you don't appreciate our hospitality." The threat was clear: drink the poison or face consequences. Malcolm watched her walk away, her steps sure and confident across the dusty ground. She moved like a woman who had never doubted her power, who had spent years perfecting the art of murder disguised as love. The bottle she'd left behind seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the fading sunlight. Malcolm knew he had perhaps hours before the entire town realized he'd uncovered their secret. The question was whether he could expose the truth before the women of Copper Ridge decided he'd become too dangerous to live. Malcolm spent the next hour documenting his findings, his pen scratching urgently across the paper as he detailed the arsenic concentrations in each sample. The evidence was damning. Every bottle contained precisely measured doses, carefully calibrated to cause maximum suffering without immediate death. This wasn't the work of one deranged woman. It was a coordinated effort that required knowledge, planning, and cold-blooded determination. The sound of approaching footsteps made him quickly hide his notes beneath a stack of medical journals. Eleanor Morrison appeared in the doorway, her thin frame silhouetted against the setting sun. Pete's wife had always been quiet, keeping to herself while her husband drank himself into oblivion. But now Malcolm saw her differently. Her silence hadn't been resignation. It had been calculation. "Doctor, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Eleanor said, her voice soft as prairie grass. "I wanted to thank you for your kindness to Pete. Not many doctors would bother with an old drunk." Malcolm studied her pale, angular face, searching for signs of the killer he now knew lurked beneath her modest exterior. "Pete's a good man." "Mrs. Morrison, alcohol may cloud his judgment, but it doesn't change his character." A strange smile played at the corners of Eleanor's mouth. "You're very observant, Doctor. Most people see what they expect to see, don't they? A drunk, a devoted wife, a caring community." She stepped further into the room, her eyes taking in his equipment with the same calculating assessment Martha had shown. "But you see patterns others miss." The admission sent ice through Malcolm's veins. Eleanor wasn't here to thank him. She was here to assess the threat he posed. He forced his voice to remain steady. "Pattern recognition is useful in medicine. Symptoms often tell a story if you know how to read them." "Stories can be dangerous things," Eleanor replied, moving closer to his workbench. "Especially when they're misunderstood. People might draw the wrong conclusions from incomplete information." Malcolm's hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip, then stopped. "Violence wouldn't solve this problem. It might even play into their hands. I always try to gather complete information before reaching any conclusions, Mrs. Morrison." Eleanor's laugh was soft as falling snow and twice as cold. "That's very wise. Though sometimes, Doctor, the complete story is more terrible than anyone could imagine." She picked up the bottle Martha had left, turning it in the lamplight. "Did you know that arsenic was once called inheritance powder because it was so popular with wives who wanted to inherit their husband's property?" The casual way she delivered this information made Malcolm's blood freeze. Eleanor Morrison knew exactly what was in that bottle, and she didn't care if he knew it too. The pretense was crumbling, revealing something far more sinister underneath. "I've read about such historical uses," Malcolm managed. "Thankfully, modern detection methods make such poisonings easier to identify." "Modern methods," Eleanor mused, setting down the bottle with deliberate care. "Yes, progress has made many things more complicated, hasn't it? Though I wonder, what good is detection if no one believes the detector?" Before Malcolm could respond, 2 more women entered the laboratory. Sarah Henderson, the banker's wife, carried a covered basket that filled the air with the scent of fresh bread. Behind her came Rebecca Cruz, whose husband ran the largest ranch outside town. Both women wore the same pleasant smiles that had fooled him for months. "Dr. Malcolm," Sarah said warmly, "we thought you might be hungry. It's past dinner time, and you've been working so hard." She set the basket on his bench, the innocent gesture somehow more threatening than a drawn gun. Rebecca moved to his other side, effectively boxing him in. "The whole town appreciates your dedication to understanding our little community better. We've been watching your research with great interest." The words hit Malcolm like physical blows. They'd been watching him. Every sample he'd collected, every test he'd run, every conclusion he'd drawn, they'd known about all of it. He was trapped in a web so carefully constructed that he hadn't even seen the threads until they were already wound around his throat. "Your research," Rebecca continued, "has helped us understand things too. For instance, we now know that you're much more perceptive than we initially believed. That's both admirable and concerning." Malcolm's mouth had gone dry. "I'm simply trying to understand the unusual pattern of illness affecting your husbands." "Oh, you understand perfectly," Sarah said, uncovering the basket to reveal fresh bread still warm from the oven. "The question is what you plan to do with that understanding." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You see, Doctor, Copper Ridge has been a peaceful town for years. The men work hard, provide for their families, and trust their wives to take care of them. It's a lovely arrangement that benefits everyone." The 3 women exchanged glances, and Malcolm saw years of shared secrets pass between them in that silent communication. These weren't desperate housewives who'd stumbled into murder. They were seasoned killers who'd perfected their craft over time. "The dying men," Rebecca repeated thoughtfully. "You mean the men who used to beat their wives? Who drank away their children's food money? Who thought their strength gave them the right to take whatever they wanted?" Her voice hardened with each word. "Those dying men?" Malcolm felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't random murder. It was systematic elimination. "You're targeting specific men." "We're protecting our community," Sarah corrected. "Some men learn to be better husbands and fathers when they're reminded of their mortality. Others," she shrugged elegantly, "others provide more value to their families as memories than as living beings." The casual brutality of the statement left Malcolm speechless. These women had appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner, using poison to enforce their twisted version of justice. And they'd been doing it long enough to develop an entire system. Eleanor moved toward the door, her departure as casual as her arrival. "Dr. Malcolm, I hope you'll consider very carefully how you want to proceed. Copper Ridge has been good to you. The people trust you, respect you. It would be unfortunate if that relationship were to change." Sarah and Rebecca followed, leaving behind the basket of bread and the overwhelming scent of yeast and secrets. As their footsteps faded into the night, Malcolm realized he was no longer investigating a mysterious illness. He was documenting a conspiracy that had turned an entire town into a carefully orchestrated killing ground. The bread in the basket looked innocent enough, but Malcolm knew better than to trust appearances. In Copper Ridge, the most deadly threats came wrapped in acts of kindness, and the most dangerous predators wore the faces of devoted wives and mothers. Malcolm didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by his window with his medical bag packed and his notes sewn into the lining of his coat. Every shadow that moved in the street below could be a woman carrying another bottle of poison or a piece of lead. The town that had welcomed him 3 months ago now felt like a trap designed by patient spiders. At dawn, He made his decision. Sheriff Tom Bradley lived at the edge of town in a small cabin behind the jail, and if any man could be trusted with this information, it would be the lawman who'd served Copper Ridge for 15 years. Malcolm gathered his evidence and stepped into the pale morning light, feeling exposed as a rabbit crossing open ground. The sheriff's cabin showed signs of the same mysterious ailment affecting the other men. Laundry hung limply on the line, clothes that had once fit a robust man but now would swallow the gaunt figure Malcolm had seen shuffling through town. Bradley answered the door looking like a scarecrow dressed in human clothing, his badge hanging loose on a shirt that had once been snug across his chest. "Doc," Bradley wheezed, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Ain't seen you around much lately. You look troubled." Malcolm studied the sheriff's yellowed eyes and trembling hands. The arsenic poisoning was advanced, but not irreversible if treatment began immediately. "Tom, I need to speak with you privately. It's about the illness affecting the men in town." Something like that. Malcolm stepped inside the sparse cabin, noting the bottles of local beer lined up on the kitchen counter. At least a dozen empties sat in a wooden crate by the door, evidence of Bradley's daily consumption of liquid death. "Tom, this conversation cannot leave this room. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I have proof." For the next hour, Malcolm laid out his findings with methodical precision. He showed Bradley the test results, explained the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, and detailed his conversations with the women. The sheriff's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to horrified understanding. "Sweet Jesus," Bradley whispered, staring at the chemical analysis papers. "You're telling me my wife has been poisoning me for months?" "Not just your wife. Every woman in town is involved. They're running a coordinated operation, Tom. They decide which men live, which men die, and which men just suffer enough to become more manageable." Bradley stood slowly, his movements shaky but determined. He walked to the window and stared out at the peaceful street where children played and women hung washing on lines. "Margaret brings me a beer every morning with breakfast, says it's good for my constitution." His voice cracked. "She holds my head when I'm sick, brings me cool cloths for my fever. They're not monsters, Tom. They genuinely believe they're protecting the community, but their methods—" Malcolm let the sentence hang in the air. The sheriff turned back, and Malcolm saw something dangerous kindle in his yellowed eyes. "My methods don't include murder." Bradley reached for his gun belt, then stopped. "How do we prove this? Who's going to believe that half the town is poisoning the other half? We need samples from multiple sources and witness testimony. If we can get one of them to confess—" "They won't confess to us," Bradley interrupted. "These women have been planning this for years. They've thought through every angle." He paused, a new realization dawning. "Doc, if they know you figured it out, why are you still breathing?" Malcolm had been wondering the same thing. "I think they're still deciding how to handle me. As long as I haven't gone public, they might hope to convert me rather than kill me. Make me complicit. If I drink their beer and stay quiet, I become part of the conspiracy instead of a threat to it." The sheriff moved to his gun cabinet and pulled out a rifle, checking its action with practiced efficiency. "We need to get word to the territorial authorities. This is bigger than anything I can handle alone." Malcolm nodded, feeling relief for the first time in days. With Bradley's help, they could expose the conspiracy and save the remaining men. "I can ride to Tucson, contact the territorial marshal. It's a 2-day journey, but—" A soft knock at the door froze both men in place. Through the window, Malcolm could see Margaret Bradley's familiar silhouette, a breakfast tray balanced in her hands. The pleasant morning domestic scene now looked like a predator stalking its prey. "Tom?" Margaret's voice carried the concern of a devoted wife. "I heard voices. Are you feeling well enough for visitors?" Bradley looked at Malcolm with eyes full of betrayal and rage. The woman he'd loved and trusted for 20 years was killing him, one sip at a time. And she was standing outside their door with another dose of poison disguised as breakfast. "Just the doc checking on me," Bradley called out, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'll be out in a minute, Maggie." Malcolm saw Bradley's jaw clench. The sheriff understood exactly what that fresh batch represented. Another day of calculated murder served with a smile and a kiss on the forehead. "Tom," Malcolm whispered urgently, "we need to act like nothing has changed. If she suspects we know—" "She's my wife," Bradley said quietly. "I've shared a bed with this woman for 20 years. How do I look at her and pretend I don't know she's been poisoning me?" The question hung between them as Margaret's footsteps grew impatient outside. Malcolm realized they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The knowledge of betrayal was written across Bradley's face like a confession, and when Margaret saw it, the careful balance of the conspiracy would shatter. The door handle turned slowly, and Margaret Bradley stepped into her husband's final moments of ignorance, carrying death in a breakfast tray and love in her lying eyes. Margaret Bradley's face registered every emotion that crossed her husband's features: confusion, betrayal, rage, and finally, terrible understanding. The breakfast tray trembled in her hands as she looked from Tom's stricken expression to Malcolm's defensive posture and back again. The 3 words carried the weight of 20 years of marriage crashing into ruins. Tom Bradley stood frozen, watching his wife transform before his eyes from the gentle woman who'd nursed him through fevers into something calculating and cold. "Don't." Margaret held up a hand, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Tom. Dr. Malcolm has clearly shared his theories with you, and now we all have decisions to make." Malcolm felt the walls of the cabin closing in around them. Margaret Bradley wasn't panicking or denying anything. She was taking control of the situation with the confidence of someone who'd anticipated this moment for months. Margaret's smile was sad and patient, like a teacher explaining a difficult lesson to a slow student. "Tom, dear, you've been sick for so long. These delusions, this paranoia, they're symptoms of your condition. Doctor, Malcolm has clearly been encouraging these fantasies instead of treating your actual illness." The gaslighting was masterful and terrifying. Malcolm watched Margaret Bradley rewrite reality in real time, casting herself as the concerned wife and him as the incompetent doctor feeding his patient's delusions. If anyone discovered them later, the story would be perfectly plausible. "Doctor," Margaret interrupted, "I think you need to leave now. My husband requires rest." Not wild accusations that upset his already fragile mental state. Tom Bradley's hand moved toward his gun, but Margaret's sharp intake of breath stopped him cold. She was no longer looking at her husband with loving concern. Her eyes held the flat, predatory stare of a cornered rattlesnake. "Tom, if you draw that weapon, this situation becomes very different very quickly. Right now, we still have options. We can still protect what matters most." "I've been saving you," Margaret replied with stunning conviction. "Saving you from yourself, from your temper, from the man you were becoming. You haven't hit me in 6 months, Tom. You haven't drunk yourself into a rage or threatened the Mexican families in town. The medicine has made you a better man." Malcolm felt sick listening to her rationalization. Margaret Bradley genuinely believed she was performing an act of love, transforming her husband through careful doses of poison into the man she wanted him to be. "Better?" Tom laughed bitterly. "I can barely stand up straight. I can't do my job properly. I'm dying, Maggie." The sound of approaching footsteps outside made all 3 of them freeze. Through the window, Malcolm could see at least 6 women walking purposefully toward the cabin, their faces set with grim determination. Sarah Henderson carried what looked like a medical bag, while Eleanor Morrison held a rifle with casual familiarity. "It seems the ladies' auxiliary has decided to pay us a visit," Margaret observed calmly. "Dr. Malcolm, you forced us into a very unfortunate position. We've spent years building something beautiful here, and you're threatening to destroy it with your interference." Malcolm moved toward the back window, calculating his chances of escape, but Tom Bradley's voice stopped him. The sheriff straightened to his full height, and despite the poison weakening his body, authority settled around him like a familiar coat. "Maggie, call off your friends. This ends here, peacefully, or I start arresting people." Margaret's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Tom, you sweet, foolish man. Who exactly do you think you're going to arrest? Martha Caldwell, who's fed half this town for 20 years. Sarah Henderson, who organized the school fundraiser that bought books for the children. Eleanor Morrison, who nursed 3 families through the influenza outbreak. Malcolm understood the brilliant cruelty of their position. These women weren't isolated killers. They were the social foundation of Copper Ridge. They organized church functions, taught children, cared for the sick, and held the community together through their countless acts of service. Accusing them of murder would be like accusing the town itself of conspiracy. This is about more than poison, Malcolm realized aloud. You've made yourselves indispensable. Even if we prove what you've done, the town would rather protect you than prosecute you. Margaret's smile returned, warm and approving. Very good, Doctor. You're beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. The women outside had formed a loose circle around the cabin, not quite a siege, but clearly preventing easy escape. Malcolm could see them through the windows, chatting quietly among themselves like neighbors gathering for a social call. The normalcy of it made his skin crawl. We want what we've always wanted, Margaret replied. A peaceful community where families are safe and men understand their responsibilities. Dr. Malcolm can help us achieve that goal, or he can continue to be an obstacle that needs to be removed. Malcolm felt the noose tightening around his throat. They were offering him the same choice they'd given every man in town: submit to their control or face the consequences. The difference was that he understood the true nature of their offer. Margaret's expression became genuinely sad. Then you'll become another cautionary tale about the dangers of interfering with things you don't understand. A tragic story about a young doctor who came to help, but whose inexperience led to unfortunate complications. Through the window, Malcolm watched Rebecca Cruz set up what looked like a medical examination table in the shade of a large oak tree. The women weren't just threatening him, they were preparing for the aftermath of his decision. Whatever happened next, they'd already planned how to explain it to the outside world. The trap was perfect, the web complete. In trying to expose the conspiracy, Malcolm had walked directly into its center, and now he faced the choice that had destroyed every man who'd threatened their carefully constructed order: join them willingly, or be destroyed by the very community they'd sworn to protect. Sarah Henderson entered the cabin first, her medical bag clicking softly as she set it on Margaret's abandoned breakfast tray. The other women followed in careful order: Eleanor Morrison with her rifle, Rebecca Cruz carrying rope, and Martha Caldwell bringing up the rear with a bottle that caught the morning light like liquid amber. "Dr. Malcolm," Sarah said pleasantly, "I think it's time we had a complete conversation about the history of Copper Ridge. Understanding context might help you make a more informed decision about your future here." Tom Bradley had sunk into a chair, his gun still holstered, but his hand resting on its grip. The arsenic had weakened him, but Malcolm could see the lawman calculating angles and distances, preparing for whatever came next. "Tom," Eleanor said gently, "this isn't about you anymore. You've been a good sheriff, even when the medicine made you difficult. We're here for the doctor." Margaret moved to stand beside her husband, her hand resting on his shoulder with practiced affection. "Tell him about Emma, Sarah. He should understand what started all this." Sarah's face hardened at the mention of the name. Emma Rodriguez was 17 when her husband decided she needed disciplining for speaking back to him. He used a branding iron from his own ranch, marked her like cattle. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles went white as she gripped her medical bag. She bled to death 3 days later while giving birth to a baby that died with her. Malcolm felt ice forming in his stomach. This wasn't beginning with random cruelty. It was beginning with a specific atrocity that had catalyzed everything that followed. "The territorial authorities called it a domestic dispute," Rebecca continued. "Said it was a husband's right to discipline his wife as he saw fit. Emma's father tried to press charges. But Miguel Rodriguez was Mexican, and his daughter had married a white man. The law protected her killer." Eleanor picked up the narrative seamlessly. "So we decided to protect ourselves. If the law wouldn't stop men like that, we would have to find other methods. You started with him, Malcolm said, understanding beginning to dawn. Emma's husband was your first victim. Martha nodded approvingly. Very good. James Kellerman was indeed our first experiment. We began with small doses in his coffee, just enough to make him sick. But he became more violent as his health deteriorated, not less. So we increased the dosage. Until the community was safe from him, Margaret corrected. His death was recorded as natural causes, a wasting disease that physicians couldn't identify. Very sad, very mysterious, and very final. Malcolm realized he was looking at the birth of a system that had evolved over years of careful refinement. How many others? 17 men over 8 years, Sarah answered matter-of-factly. Some died, some learned to behave properly, and some left town when they realized they weren't welcome anymore. The success rate has been quite encouraging. The casual discussion of mass murder delivered in the tones of a church ladies' planning committee made Malcolm's head spin. These women had industrialized domestic justice, turning poison into policy and murder into social reform. We're protectors, Eleanor corrected. We protect children from fathers who use them as punching bags. We protect wives from husbands who think marriage is a license for violence. We protect the community from men who take what they want and destroy what they can't control. The women exchanged those meaningful glances again, and Malcolm saw the democracy of their conspiracy. This wasn't one mad woman poisoning her neighbors. It was a collective decision-making process that involved discussion, debate, and careful consideration. We all decide, Martha said simply. When a man's behavior becomes problematic, we observe, we document, we discuss. If the majority agrees that intervention is necessary, we act. Treatment, Rebecca clarified. Some men respond well to low doses that just make them feel poorly enough to reconsider their actions. Others require stronger medicine. A few need the ultimate cure. Malcolm looked around the cabin at the faces of women who'd appointed themselves as judge, jury, and executioner for an entire community. They weren't cackling villains or deranged killers. They were thoughtful, organized citizens who'd created a system of justice that existed outside the law. The territorial authorities called Emma Rodriguez's death a domestic dispute, Sarah replied. Their justice protects men like James Kellerman while women and children suffer. Our justice actually works. Tom Bradley struggled to his feet, his badge catching the light. This is insane. You can't just decide to kill people because you don't like their behavior. Can't we? Margaret asked gently. Tom, dear, in the past year, how many domestic disturbance calls have you responded to? How many women have come to you with bruises they claimed were from falling downstairs? How many children have shown up at school with marks they said came from accidents? None, Margaret continued, because our system works. The men of Copper Ridge have learned to be better husbands and fathers, or they've been removed from the equation entirely. The result is a peaceful, safe community where families can thrive. Malcolm felt the terrible logic of their argument settling around him like quicksand. They weren't wrong about the results. Copper Ridge was peaceful. Crime was virtually non-existent. Children played safely in the streets. The community was prosperous and stable. But the foundation of that prosperity was a conspiracy of murder that had claimed 17 lives and broken countless others. The peace they'd created was built on a pyramid of bodies, and they were inviting him to help add to the pile. Dr. Malcolm, Martha said, offering him the bottle she'd carried. You have a choice to make. You can join us in protecting this community, or you can try to destroy everything we've built. But understand that the second choice comes with consequences you may not survive. The bottle caught the light again, its contents seeming to glow with malevolent promise. Malcolm stared at it and realized he was looking at his own death sentence, carefully measured and precisely calibrated to look like natural causes when they found his body. Malcolm stared at the bottle in Martha's outstretched hand, understanding that his next words would determine whether he lived to see sunset. Around him, the women of Copper Ridge waited with the patience of predators who'd already calculated every possible outcome. Before I decide, Malcolm said carefully, I need to understand something. You say you're protecting the community, but what about the innocent men, the ones who aren't violent or abusive? Are they acceptable casualties in your war? Eleanor Morrison shifted uncomfortably, the first crack Malcolm had seen in their unified front. We don't target innocent men. Every intervention is justified by documented behavior. What about Pete Morrison? Malcolm pressed. Your own husband. What crime did he commit that earned him a death sentence? The cabin fell silent, except for the ticking of Tom Bradley's clock on the mantelpiece. Eleanor's face had gone pale, and she wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Pete is a drunk, Eleanor said finally. He wastes money, embarrasses the family, sets a poor example for the children in town. But he's never hit you, Malcolm observed. Never hurt anyone except himself. You've been giving him whiskey instead of beer to keep him alive because even you know he doesn't deserve to die. Rebecca Cruz stepped forward, her voice sharp with warning. Dr. Malcolm, you're making dangerous assumptions about situations you don't fully understand. But Malcolm had found a thread, and he pulled at it relentlessly. How many others? How many men died simply because they were inconvenient rather than dangerous? How many families lost fathers and husbands because you decided their flaws were unacceptable? Enough. Margaret Bradley's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Dr. Malcolm, you're trying to create divisions where none exist. We've spent years building consensus, and we won't let your outsider's perspective destroy our unity. Malcolm looked around the cabin at faces that had hardened back into resolve. His attempt to fracture their alliance had failed, but he'd learned something crucial. There were fault lines in their conspiracy, doubts and disagreements that they'd papered over with group solidarity. Tom, Malcolm said, turning to the sheriff, they're going to kill me whether I drink that poison or not. They can't let me leave town with what I know, and they can't trust me to stay quiet. This isn't about choice. It's about timing. Tom Bradley met his eyes, and Malcolm saw understanding pass between them. The sheriff's hand closed around his gun grip, and despite his weakened condition, authority settled around him like armor. The women's reaction was swift and coordinated. Sarah Henderson dove for her medical bag while Eleanor Morrison raised her rifle. Rebecca Cruz moved to flank Tom's position, and Martha Caldwell backed toward the door. Only Margaret remained still, her hand resting possessively on her husband's shoulder. The sheriff drew his gun with movements slowed by months of poisoning, but his aim remained steady. Maybe so, Maggie, but I swore an oath to protect this town, and that includes protecting it from you. Eleanor's rifle swung toward Tom, but Malcolm lunged sideways, grabbing a kitchen chair and hurling it at her. The weapon discharged into the ceiling, filling the small cabin with smoke and splinters. Sarah Henderson's medical bag had opened to reveal not instruments of healing, but a collection of bottles, syringes, and powders that could kill a man in minutes. She grabbed a vial of clear liquid and advanced on Malcolm with the focused intensity of a woman who'd perfected murder through years of practice. Malcolm backed against the wall, his mind racing through options that all led to death. Through the window, he could see more women gathering outside, drawn by the gunshot. The entire conspiracy was converging on this moment, and he was trapped at its center. Tom Bradley's gun tracked Eleanor Morrison as she worked the bolt on her rifle, but his movements were sluggish and his hands shook from the arsenic in his system. Eleanor, put down the weapon. This doesn't have to end badly. It already has ended badly, Eleanor replied, her voice thick with regret. The moment you chose loyalty to him over loyalty to your community. Margaret Bradley stepped away from her husband, her face filled with genuine sorrow. Tom, you could have had years left, weak perhaps, but alive. Now, she shrugged helplessly. Now we have to clean up this mess. Rebecca Cruz had circled behind the sheriff, and Malcolm saw the glint of a knife in her hand. Tom was caught between 3 armed women in a space too small for tactical maneuvering. And the poison in his system had slowed his reflexes to the point where he couldn't effectively defend himself. Malcolm's eyes fell on the breakfast tray Margaret had brought, specifically on the bottle of poisoned beer that had started this confrontation. In a moment of desperate inspiration, he grabbed the bottle and smashed it against the wall, filling the air with the sharp scent of hops and arsenic. The sheriff understood immediately. His shot took the kerosene lamp off its hook, sending burning oil cascading across the wooden floor. The women scattered as flames began to spread, their careful coordination disrupted by the sudden chaos. Malcolm dove through the window in a shower of glass and wood splinters, hitting the ground hard and rolling toward the cover of a nearby water trough. Behind him, the cabin began to burn in earnest, black smoke pouring from the broken windows. But even as he ran, Malcolm knew the fire was only a temporary reprieve. The women of Copper Ridge had spent years perfecting their system, and they wouldn't let one man's escape destroy everything they'd built. They would hunt him through the desert if necessary, and they had the entire town's resources at their disposal. The conspiracy would not die with a burning cabin. It would adapt, evolve, and continue until someone with more power than a small-town doctor could bring it to justice. Malcolm's only hope was to reach the territorial authorities before the women of Copper Ridge could silence him permanently. As he ran through the streets of the town that had become his prison, Malcolm realized that exposing the truth would require more than evidence. It would require surviving long enough to present that evidence to people who might actually believe it. Malcolm made it 3 blocks before the organized pursuit began. Behind him, the sheriff's cabin burned like a funeral pyre. But the women of Copper Ridge moved with the efficiency of a military unit. They'd spent years planning for contingencies, and his escape had clearly been anticipated. Sarah Henderson appeared at the end of Main Street, carrying her medical bag and flanked by 2 younger women Malcolm recognized as schoolteachers. Eleanor Morrison's rifle barrel glinted from the rooftop of the general store, while Rebecca Cruz coordinated a search pattern that would systematically check every building in town. Malcolm ducked into the church, hoping sanctuary might provide literal protection, but found Martha Caldwell waiting in the front pew with the patience of someone who'd predicted his exact movements. "Dr. Malcolm," she said without turning around, "running only makes this harder for everyone. We're not monsters. If you'd simply accepted our offer, none of this violence would have been necessary." Malcolm backed toward the altar, his eyes scanning for another exit. "You're mass murderers. 17 men, Martha. 17 families destroyed because you decided their fathers and husbands were inconvenient." Martha stood slowly, her movements betraying the arthritis she'd hidden beneath years of maternal competence. 17 men who would have hurt more people if we'd allowed them to live. Our methods may seem harsh, but our results speak for themselves. Your results are built on terror. Every man in this town lives in fear of stepping out of line, never knowing if his morning coffee contains medicine or poison. And what's wrong with that? Martha's voice carried genuine confusion. Men have spent centuries using fear to control women and children. Is it so terrible that we've found a way to return the favor? Malcolm felt the altar steps against his back, cornering him in the house of God while discussing the theology of murder. "This isn't justice, Martha. It's revenge." "Justice," Martha repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me, doctor, what was the justice for Emma Rodriguez? What was the justice for Mary Kellerman's broken arm? For little Susan Bradley's bruises before we taught her father some manners?" Her voice hardened with each example. "The law failed us, so we created our own justice." Through the church windows, Malcolm could see the net tightening around him. The women had positioned themselves with military precision, cutting off every escape route while maintaining the appearance of concerned citizens searching for a missing person. "Even if you kill me," Malcolm said desperately, "others will come. The territorial authorities will investigate. You can't hide this forever." Martha's smile was patient and infuriating. "Dr. Malcolm, you're going to die of a sudden illness brought on by the stress of losing your first patients. Dr. Sarah Henderson will confirm the diagnosis, and the territorial authorities will send their condolences. Life in frontier towns is difficult, and young doctors sometimes find the pressure overwhelming. The completeness of their planning was terrifying. Malcolm realized they'd already written his obituary, planned his funeral, and prepared explanations for his death that would satisfy any outside investigation. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting against a system that had perfected the art of making murder look like misfortune. "Because I want you to understand that this isn't personal," Martha replied. "We don't hate you, Doctor. We simply can't allow you to destroy something we've spent years building. Your death will serve a purpose. It will protect this community from chaos and violence." The church door opened, and Margaret Bradley entered with the measured steps of a woman walking to her own execution. Her husband's blood stained her dress, and her face showed the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd crossed a line she could never uncross. "It's finished," Margaret announced. "Tom fought well, but the poison had weakened him too much. He died protecting you, Dr. Malcolm. I hope you appreciate the sacrifice." Malcolm felt the last foundation of hope crumble beneath his feet. Tom Bradley had been his only ally, the one person with enough authority to legitimize his accusations. Without the sheriff's testimony, Malcolm was just a young doctor making wild claims against respected community members. "Now," Margaret continued, "we can end this cleanly. Dr. Malcolm, you've seen what we're capable of. You've watched a good man die because he chose to oppose us. Don't make his sacrifice meaningless by forcing us to hurt more people." Sarah Henderson appeared in the doorway, carrying a syringe filled with clear liquid. Her approach was unhurried and professional, like a physician preparing to administer necessary medicine to a reluctant patient. "This won't hurt," Sarah promised. "You'll simply go to sleep, and when they find you tomorrow, it will look like your heart gave out from the stress. Very peaceful, very dignified." "Doctor," Martha said gently, "you're in God's house. Surely you don't want to commit violence in such a sacred place." The irony was bitter as poison. These women had turned murder into a sacrament, performed their killings with the righteousness of crusaders, and now they invoked sanctity to prevent him from defending himself. Eleanor Morrison entered through the side door, her rifle trained on Malcolm's chest. "It's over, Doctor. You fought well, but you can't win against the entire town." Malcolm looked around the church at the faces of women who'd transformed themselves from victims into executioners. They'd built their conspiracy on real grievances and genuine suffering, but they'd poisoned their own souls in the process of poisoning their enemies. But as Sarah Henderson approached with her lethal syringe, Malcolm made one final play. He'd sewn his evidence into his coat lining, but he'd also prepared a second set of documents, a complete confession and analysis that he'd hidden in the church Bible itself, written in the margins of Ecclesiastes during his lonely nights of research. "I've been hiding evidence in God's house," Malcolm continued, opening the Bible to reveal his hidden writings. "Every detail of your conspiracy, every victim's name, every chemical analysis. If anything happens to me, the next minister who reads this book will find complete documentation of 17 murders." Sarah Henderson's syringe froze inches from his arm. The women realized that killing him wouldn't destroy the evidence. It would only add credibility to his posthumous accusations. "Now," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "we're going to discuss new terms, because if I die, this Bible becomes my final testimony, and every word in it will be believed." But even as he spoke, Malcolm saw Martha Caldwell's eyes calculating new possibilities. The women of Copper Ridge had spent years perfecting murder. They wouldn't let a hidden confession stop them from protecting their conspiracy. They would find a way to kill him and destroy his evidence. And the last thing Malcolm would taste would be the bitter poison of their perverted justice.